Russia didn't realize anything was wrong until the system protecting Crimea simply stopped working. And by the time they understood why, it was already too late. Because when the smoke cleared over the Black Sea on the night of April 6th, Russia wasn't just looking at a burning offshore platform. It was looking at proof that Ukraine has been holding back capabilities that force a complete rethinking of how this war is actually being fought. For months, the assumption inside Moscow was clear. Ukraine's ability to strike high-value targets was becoming limited, predictable, increasingly dependent on drones that could be disrupted or degraded. That assumption is now broken. Because the weapon used in that strike has a name, the RBS-15 missile, sometimes referred to as Gungnir, the so-called Spear of Odin. It sounds like mythology, something symbolic, not something operating inside a real combat zone against a defended Russian position. But Gungnir is real. It is already in Ukraine, and it has already been used in combat. And the targeted hit was not random. It was part of a defensive system protecting Russian positions in the Black Sea, which means what happened that night wasn't just a successful strike. It was a breach. A breach that may have opened a corridor into areas Russia believed were still protected. And what we're about to walk you through is the full story of how Sweden's most advanced anti-ship missile entered this war, what it actually dismantled, and why the events of April 6th may have changed the well-most. Strategic picture in the Black Sea more than it first appeared. Stay with us, because this story goes far deeper than a single strike. At first, the story looks straightforward. On April 6th, reports began to surface that Ukraine had carried out a strike against the Swedish offshore platform in the Black Sea. Robert Brovdy, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, confirmed the operation in a public statement, describing a coordinated strike involving drone units working alongside naval assets. Video followed quickly. The footage showed Ukrainian drones approaching the platform at low altitude, moving over open water before striking their target with apparent precision. To most observers, the conclusion was immediate. Another Ukrainian drone strike. Effective, well executed, but not fundamentally different from the pattern that has defined Ukraine's maritime operations throughout this war. Even the target seemed familiar. The Swedish platform was widely described as an offshore oil installation located roughly 60 to 80 kilometers from the Crimean coast. Close enough to matter, but still viewed primarily as infrastructure, not a critical military node. So the narrative settled quickly. Ukraine used drones. The platform was hit. The operation was complete. But that version of events left something out. Because what people saw that night was only the visible phase of the operation, the final act. And it avoided a far more important question. If Swedish was simply an exposed offshore platform, why did it matter enough to be targeted at all? And if it wasn't exposed, then how did those drones get through a defended position in the first place? That's where the story begins to shift. Because Swedish was not just an oil platform. By the time Ukraine struck it, it had already been repurposed into something far more significant, a forward defensive node inside Russia's Black Sea network. At some point during the war, Russian forces equipped the platform with radar systems, short-range air defense detection equipment, and more importantly, electronic warfare systems designed to protect surrounding assets, including positions in Crimea. That changes the picture entirely, because this wasn't an unprotected structure sitting in open water. It was part of a layered defense system, one built to detect incoming threats, disrupt their guidance, and degrade their ability to strike accurately. And that creates a contradiction, because under those conditions, the strike that people saw shouldn't have worked. Those drones were not supposed to maintain stable navigation, they were not supposed to retain targeting precision, and they were not supposed to successfully hit a platform actively protected by electronic interference. Which means the real story isn't about the drones. It's about what happened before they arrived. Because something had to remove that protection first. Something had to cut through the interference, degrade the system, and create a window where precision became possible again. And whatever did that was never visible in the footage. And that brings us to the real problem Ukraine was facing. Because Swedish wasn't just a target sitting in open water, it was part of a defensive structure designed to prevent exactly this kind of strike. The platform's electronic warfare systems created a controlled environment around it, a zone where GPS signals could be disrupted, navigation degraded, and incoming threats quietly neutralized before they ever reached their objective. Which means the challenge wasn't distance. It was precision. Modern strikes don't fail because they can't reach a target. They fail because they lose accuracy at the moment it matters most, and Swedish was built to exploit exactly that weakness. The closer a drone got, the less reliable its guidance became. The more precise the strike needed to be, the harder it became to achieve. So even if Ukraine could send drones toward the platform, they wouldn't hit what actually mattered. They might reach the structure, but they wouldn't reliably disable the systems mounted on it, the radars, the electronic warfare, the protective layer itself. And against a defensive node like Swedish, that distinction is everything. Because this wasn't about damage. It was about removal. Ukraine wasn't trying to hit the platform. It was trying to break the system, protecting it. And as long as that system remained intact, nothing else would work. So Ukraine didn't start with the drones. It started by removing the protection. And this is where the hidden layer begins to come into focus. Before the strike footage ever appeared, another weapon had already been used, the RBS-15 missile, the system we referred to earlier as Gungnir. A missile specifically designed to operate in contested electromagnetic environments, where jamming and signal disruption are not just expected, but constant. That changes the sequence. Phase 1 was system neutralization. The missiles were used to target the electronic warfare components on the Swedish platform. Unlike drones, they were not dependent on vulnerable GPS signals alone. They carried their own countermeasures, allowing them to cut through interference and maintain targeting accuracy even under active jamming. Which meant they could do something drones could not. They could get through, and they could hit precisely. Phase 2 was system collapse. Once those electronic warfare systems were damaged or destroyed, the protective layer around Swedish disappeared. The interference zone, the invisible shield that had been protecting the platform, was gone. The structure was still there, but the system that made it defensible wasn't. Phase 3 was strike execution. Only then did the drones move in. And this time, the conditions had changed completely. Without interference, navigation stabilized. Targeting systems functioned as intended. Precision returned. What the world saw in the footage, the drones striking the platform, happened here. But by that point, the outcome had already been decided. Phase 4 was the resulting advantage. The platform was destroyed. The radars were taken offline. The defensive node was removed. But the real impact wasn't the destruction itself. It was the gap that was created. A gap in a defensive network that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of operation. And once that gap exists, it doesn't just affect one target, it affects everything behind it. Seen as a single event, the strike on Swedish looks like a successful operation. Seen as a system, it becomes something else entirely. Because this wasn't about one weapon outperforming another. It was about how multiple layers were combined into a sequence that produced a controlled outcome. First came identification, recognizing that Swedish was not just infrastructure, but a functional part of a defensive network. Then disruption, using a system capable of operating inside contested electromagnetic conditions to remove the interference layer. Then execution, deploying drones only after the environment had been reshaped in their favor. And finally, exploitation, using the gap created by that disruption to open access to previously protected areas. This is what matters. Because once a system like this is understood, it can be repeated. Not necessarily in the same way, not necessarily on the same target, but using the same logic. And that's where the problem begins for Russia, because the question is no longer whether Ukraine can strike defended targets. The question is whether those defenses can hold once their structure is understood. And once that structure starts to break, it doesn't fail all at once. It unravels. But operations like this don't appear out of nowhere. They are learned. Because for much of this war, Russia's electronic warfare systems have been one of its most consistent advantages. They didn't need to intercept every incoming threat. They only needed to make those threats unreliable to disrupt navigation, degrade precision, and quietly reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes. And early on, that worked. Drones lost course, targeting failed. Strikes that should have landed cleanly became inconsistent. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. But over time, that consistency became a pattern. And patterns can be studied. Ukraine began to observe how these systems were deployed, where they were positioned, how they interacted with radar coverage, and most importantly, where their limits were. Instead of trying to overwhelm the system, Ukraine adapted to it. It started targeting the system itself. That's the shift, from reacting to dismantling. Swedish reflects that transition. Not just a strike, but a process. Identify the node. Remove the interference. Execute under new conditions. That is not improvisation. That is learned behavior. And once that kind of learning takes hold, the balance begins to change. Because now, it's no longer one side controlling the environment. It's both sides actively trying to reshape it. And once a system like Swedish is removed, the consequences don't stay local. Because that platform wasn't just sitting in isolation, it was part of a wider defensive network protecting Russian positions across the Black Sea, particularly Crimea. Its radars extended detection range. Its electronic warfare systems created interference. Together, they formed a layer of protection over a critical region. Now that layer is gone, which means the space it once covered is no longer protected in the same way. Incoming drones and missiles no longer face the same level of disruption. Navigation becomes more reliable. Targeting becomes more precise. And that changes how future operations can be planned. Instead of avoiding defended zones, Ukraine can now move through them. That creates options. Options to strike deeper. Options to target assets that were previously too risky to engage. Options to apply pressure in areas that had been relatively secure. And it creates uncertainty. Because once a defensive system is shown to be vulnerable, it forces a response. Coverage has to be restructured. Resources have to be shifted. Gaps have to be filled often quickly, and often under pressure. And that introduces friction. This is where the system begins to strain. Because the more adjustments that have to be made, the harder it becomes to maintain a stable defensive structure. And in a war defined by timing and precision, instability is a weakness. But what happened at Swedish doesn't stop at the level of tactics or systems. Because the capability that made this operation possible didn't originate in Ukraine alone. It came from Sweden. And that matters more than it appears. For over 2 centuries, Sweden maintained a position of military neutrality. It avoided alignment, stayed out of conflict, and built its defense policy around independence rather than integration. That changed after 2022. And what we're seeing now is the result of that shift, not just political alignment, but operational involvement. Because the presence of the RBS 15 inches, Ukraine's arsenal is not just a weapons transfer, it is a signal of integration. A Swedish-designed system used in coordination with Ukrainian forces to dismantle a Russian defensive structure in an active war zone. That level of coordination changes the equation. For Moscow, it reinforces a growing reality. Countries that were once on the sidelines are now shaping the battlefield not through direct confrontation, but through the systems they provide and the capabilities they enable. And it raises a larger question. If Sweden can provide this level of capability, what about others? Countries that operate similar systems, countries that have already committed military support, countries that may now see a proven model for how these weapons can be used effectively. Because once a capability is demonstrated, it becomes easier to expand. And that's where the geopolitical pressure begins to build, not just around Ukraine, but across the broader network of alliances now involved in this conflict. In the end, what happened at Swedish wasn't just a successful strike, it was a demonstration. A demonstration that defensive systems can be identified, understood, and dismantled. And once they are dismantled, everything behind them becomes exposed. That changes the structure of the war. Because now, the question is no longer whether Ukraine has the ability to strike deeper targets. The question is whether Russia can maintain the systems that prevent those strikes from happening in the first place. And that is a far more difficult problem to solve. Because systems can be rebuilt. But once their logic is understood, they can be broken again. Which means what happened in the Black Sea may not be an isolated event. It may be the beginning of a pattern. And if that pattern continues, the real question isn't what was destroyed. It's what becomes vulnerable next. If you want to stay ahead of how this war is evolving and understand the systems behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed to US Fury Force. Because what we're seeing now is only the beginning.